The watercraft that Magnus Erikson built on the shores of Lake Superior in 1914 looked like someone had peeled the skin off a birch tree, shaped it into a boat, and expected it to actually float while carrying cargo. While every other trapper, fisherman, and trader in the region used heavy wooden boats built from planks, ribs, and iron fastenings, Magnus had constructed a canoe entirely from birch bark, spruce roots, and pine pitch. No nails, no screws, no metal at all. Just bark, roots, and resin holding together a vessel that appeared so fragile you could puncture it with your finger. From a distance, it looked like a large piece of tree bark floating on the water. Up close, it looked like an accident waiting to happen. "That's not a boat," said Anders Nordstrom, whose sturdy plank canoe sat beached nearby. "That's tree bark, sewn together with roots. Magnus, bark tears, bark rots. Bark isn't boat material. You've built something that will sink or fall apart the first time you try to load it." Magnus was applying a final layer of pine pitch to a seam, using a flat wooden spatula to work the warm resin into perfect smoothness. He didn't pause in his careful work. "This is a proper birch bark canoe, built the way the Ojibwe have built them for thousands of years. It's stronger than your plank boat, lighter, faster, and it will carry 400 pounds more cargo than yours." 400 pounds more? "Magnus, your boat weighs maybe 60 pounds total. Mine weighs 200 pounds. My boat has thick planks, solid ribs, iron fastenings. Yours has bark, thin bark. How can something made of bark carry more than something made of solid wood? Because weight isn't strength. Your boat is heavy, which means less capacity for cargo. My boat is light, which means more capacity. Your boat is rigid, which means it fights the water and the load. My boat is flexible, which means it works with the water and distributes the load. Every aspect of bark construction is superior for cargo capacity. Flexibility isn't strength. If I put 400 pounds more in your boat than in mine, your bark will flex so much it tears apart, or the seams will open, or the whole thing will just fold in half. Bark can't handle serious weight." Bark can handle far more weight than you imagine. The birch bark is perhaps 3/16 of an inch thick, seems fragile, but the structure is incredibly strong. The bark has thousands of thin layers, like paper stacked together. Each layer reinforces the others. The bark can flex without tearing. The root lashing is stronger than rope. The pine pitch seals everything watertight. The design has been perfected over millennia. This isn't an experiment. This is proven technology. Technology? It's a bark boat. If it's so good, why aren't boat builders using bark? Why do we use planks and nails? Because planks and nails work. Bark doesn't. Boat builders use planks because that's what European tradition taught them. They don't know bark construction. They've never learned it. The Ojibwe, the Cree, the Algonquin, dozens of nations used bark canoes for everything. Transportation, trade, war. These weren't toys. These were serious working vessels that carried enormous loads across vast distances. The design works. You just don't understand it yet. Anders shook his head slowly. "I think you're going to find out that European boat-building tradition exists because it works. Bark traditions exist for making light canoes for rivers, not for heavy cargo work on Superior. When you try to load your bark boat with serious weight, it will fail, and I'll help you build a proper plank boat afterward. It won't fail, and when it proves it can carry 400 pounds more than your boat, you'll admit bark construction is superior." "Deal, but I'm confident. Bark can't compete with planks for cargo capacity. It's too fragile." Other fishermen and traders at the landing had similar reactions. The consensus was unanimous. Magnus had built something impractical. Bark canoes were fine for light use, for moving quickly with minimal gear, but for serious cargo hauling, you needed a serious boat. Planks, heavy construction, solid materials. Magnus's bark canoe was a curiosity, maybe an interesting craft project, but it would never compete with real working boats for cargo capacity. Some thought Magnus was being romantic, trying to recreate indigenous technology without understanding its limitations. Others thought he was being cheap, Bark and roots cost nothing, planks and fastenings cost money. A few thought he simply didn't understand boats and would learn through failure. Magnus ignored all the skepticism. He'd spent 3 years living with an Ojibwe family on the North Shore. He'd watched their elder, a man named Makwa, build birch-bark canoes. He'd helped with the construction. He'd learned every step of the process. He'd paddled those canoes. He'd seen them carry incredible loads. He'd understood that bark canoe technology was far more sophisticated than Europeans realized. The canoe he'd built was 26 feet long and 36 inches wide at the center, large for a bark canoe, but within the traditional size range. The frame was white cedar, lightweight but strong. The ribs were thin cedar slats, bent to shape. The gunnels were cedar strips reinforcing the top edges. The thwarts were cedar crosspieces providing structural rigidity, all held together without metal. The bark was paper birch, Betula papyrifera. The bark came from mature trees with thick, layered bark. Magnus had harvested it carefully in late spring when the sap was running and the bark peeled easily. He'd taken large sheets, each one as big as he could get. Fewer seams meant fewer potential leak points. The bark was placed with the white side out. The inner layer of the tree became the outer surface of the canoe. This orientation used the bark's natural strength properly. The bark was sewn to the frame using spruce root. Magnus had gathered long spruce roots, split them, and processed them into thin, flexible lashing material, stronger than any rope. The root lashing went through holes auled in the bark, creating seams that were both structural and watertight. The seams in all joints were sealed with pine pitch. Magnus had harvested pitch from white pine trees and processed it by heating with a small amount of charcoal and animal fat. The mixture created a waterproof seal that remained flexible. It wouldn't crack or peel. The design incorporated sophisticated engineering that wasn't immediately obvious. The bottom was flat with a shallow V-section. This provided stability and load distribution. The sides curved up and out. This shape maximized interior volume while maintaining hydrodynamic efficiency. The ends were tapered and upswept. This allowed the canoe to ride over waves rather than plowing through them. The gunnels were reinforced with cap pieces that distributed stress. The thwarts were positioned to reinforce critical stress points. Every structural element served multiple purposes: lightweight, strong, functional. The total weight of the finished canoe was 57 pounds. Magnus could carry it on his shoulders alone. Anders's plank canoe, of similar length, weighed 220 pounds. Required 2 men to move. The weight difference was enormous. The first test came in late June when Magnus loaded his canoe with trade goods to take to a settlement 40 miles up the coast. He loaded 600 pounds of supplies: furs, tools, food, equipment. The canoe settled in the water but maintained good freeboard. It paddled easily. It handled waves well. It performed exactly as expected. When Magnus returned 3 days later, he paddled straight to where Anders' boat was beached. 600 pounds, 40 miles up coast, 40 miles back. No problems, no leaks, no structural issues. The bark canoe works perfectly. Anders was skeptical. 600 pounds isn't that impressive. My boat can handle that easily. Your boat weighs 220 pounds. Add 600 pounds cargo and you're moving 820 pounds total. My boat weighs 57 pounds. Add 600 pounds cargo and I'm moving 657 pounds total. I'm moving less total weight, which means better performance. But more importantly, let's test maximum capacity. We load both boats until they can't safely carry more. We see which has more cargo capacity. Fine. Tomorrow, we fill them both and see what happens. The next morning, a crowd gathered at the landing. Word had spread. The bark canoe versus the plank boat. Cargo capacity test. People wanted to see which would win. Most expected the plank boat. Solid construction would beat fragile bark. Magnus and Anders started loading. They used standardized weights. 50-pound sacks of sand. Easy to count, easy to measure. They loaded Anders's plank boat first. 50 pounds. 100 pounds. 200 pounds. The boat settled lower. At 400 pounds, it was getting deep in the water. At 600 pounds, the freeboard was minimal. At 700 pounds, water was inches from the gunnels. "That's my limit," Anders said. 700 pounds. Any more and I'd risk swamping in any waves. 700 pounds. The crowd noted it. Now Magnus's bark canoe, 50 pounds, 100 pounds, 200 pounds. The canoe settled but maintained excellent freeboard. At 400 pounds, it was riding lower but still safe. At 600 pounds, similar to where Anders's boat had been at 400. At 800 pounds, the canoe was deep but stable. At 1,000 pounds, the freeboard was still adequate. At 1,100 pounds, Magnus called it. "That's my safe limit, 1,100 pounds. I could probably add more, but for safe operation in Superior's waves, 1,100 is maximum." 1,100 pounds in the bark canoe, 700 pounds in the plank boat, 400 pounds more capacity in the boat made of bark. The crowd was silent. They just witnessed something that contradicted everything they thought they knew about boats. The bark canoe, which looked fragile and seemed impossible, carried 400 pounds more than the solid plank boat. Anders stood staring at the two loaded boats. "I don't understand. How can bark carry more than planks? The bark should tear under that weight. The seams should open. The boat should fold or buckle." "The bark is stronger than you realize. The layered structure distributes stress. The flexibility allows the hull to adjust to the load. The boat doesn't fight the weight, it accepts it and redistributes it. Your plank boat is rigid. It concentrates stress at the joints and fastenings. The rigid structure limits how much it can hold before structural failure. My flexible structure can hold far more because the stress is distributed throughout the entire hull. And the weight of the boat itself matters. Your boat weighs 220 pounds. That's 220 pounds of capacity you're wasting on the boat structure. My boat weighs 57 pounds. That's 163 pounds less dead weight. That's 163 pounds more available for cargo. The lighter boat automatically has more cargo capacity." The crowd began asking questions. How was it built? Where did the materials come from? Could they learn to build bark canoes? Magnus spent the rest of the morning explaining the construction process. The materials, the techniques, the engineering principles. Not everyone understood fully, but everyone understood the results. 400 pounds more capacity, 1/4 the boat weight, superior performance. These facts were undeniable. Over the next month, 7 people asked Magnus to teach them bark canoe construction. He agreed to hold a workshop. They would build a canoe together. Everyone would learn the process. The workshop happened in August. 15 people attended. Magnus demonstrated each step: harvesting bark, processing roots, making pitch, building the frame, shaping the bark, sewing the seams, sealing with pitch. The construction took 2 weeks, working together. The result was a 22-foot canoe that weighed 63 pounds and could carry 900 pounds safely. The participants were amazed by the process, the sophistication, the engineering, the attention to detail. This wasn't primitive technology. This was highly refined technology developed over thousands of years. Every technique had purpose. Every material choice had reasoning. The knowledge was deep and complex. By fall 1914, 3 new bark canoes were operating on Lake Superior. By summer 1915, 10. By 1920, over 30. The technique spread among people who valued efficiency and performance. The bark canoes outperformed plank boats consistently. The weight advantage translated to better speed, better fuel efficiency when using sail, better portability, better cargo capacity. The advantages were numerous and significant. If you're starting to see that ancient indigenous technology often outperforms modern methods, that the lightest solution can be the strongest, that flexibility beats rigidity in many applications, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. We're uncovering wisdom that most people have dismissed or forgotten. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you're learning what truly works. Now let's look at the science and engineering behind why Magnus's bark canoe could carry so much more weight than plank boats. The physics and engineering of bark canoe construction involves multiple sophisticated principles working together. First, the strength-to-weight ratio. This is fundamental to understanding cargo capacity. A boat's cargo capacity is limited by its displacement and stability, not by material strength in most cases. Displacement is the amount of water the boat pushes aside. A boat sinks until the weight of displaced water equals the total weight of boat plus cargo. For safe operation, you need adequate freeboard. The boat must ride high enough that waves don't swamp it. The total weight a boat can carry equals the maximum safe displacement minus the weight of the boat itself. If boat A weighs 200 pounds and can safely displace 1,000 pounds total, it can carry 800 pounds of cargo. If boat B weighs 50 pounds and can safely displace 1,000 pounds total, it can carry 950 pounds of cargo. Boat B, despite being lighter and seemingly more fragile, carries more cargo because less weight is wasted on the boat structure. Magnus's bark canoe weighed 57 pounds. Anders's plank boat weighed 220 pounds. Both were similar size and could displace similar amounts of water safely. But the bark canoe had 163 pounds less dead weight. That translated directly to 163 pounds more cargo capacity from weight savings alone. The actual capacity difference was 400 pounds. The additional 237 pounds came from superior design. Second, the flexibility advantage. Rigid structures concentrate stress at joints and connections. A wooden plank boat has joints where planks meet ribs, where ribs meet the keel, where gunnels attach. These joints are stress concentration points. When the boat is loaded, stress concentrates at these points. The fastenings, whether nails or screws, must resist all the force. If you overload the boat, these joints fail first. A bark canoe has no rigid joints in the same way. The bark hull is continuous. The root lashing allows some flex. The entire structure can deform slightly under load. This distributes stress throughout the entire hull rather than concentrating it at points. The result is that the hull can safely carry more load because no single point is overstressed. Third, the material properties of birch bark. Bark is composed of thin layers of cellulose fibers. In paper birch, these layers are extremely thin and numerous. A 3/16 inch thick piece of bark might have 50 to 80 distinct layers. Each layer is bonded to the layers above and below it. When stress is applied, all layers work together. The multi-layer structure resists tearing far better than a single layer of equivalent total thickness would. The bark also has natural flexibility. It can bend without breaking. This flexibility allows the hull shape to optimize under load. As weight is added, the hull deforms slightly, adjusting to distribute the load optimally. A rigid hull can't adjust. It either holds the shape or fails. Fourth, the hydrodynamic shape. Magnus's canoe had a flat bottom with shallow V-sections and curved sides. This shape maximized interior volume for a given waterline length. More interior volume means more cargo space. The shape also provided excellent stability. Wide at the waterline, narrow at the bottom. This form resisted tipping. The traditional bark canoe shape evolved over thousands of years. Every aspect was optimized through trial and error across generations. The result was near-perfect design for cargo capacity and stability. Fifth, the material selection and processing. Not all birch bark is suitable. Magnus used bark from mature trees, thick bark with many layers, harvested at the right season when it peeled easily. The cedar frame components were selected for straight grain and lack of knots. The spruce roots were long and flexible. Each material was processed correctly. The pitch mixture had the right proportions. Attention to material quality ensured structural integrity. Sixth, the construction techniques. The sewing pattern for the bark used specific stitching that provided strength without creating weak points. the spacing of stitches, the overlap of bark pieces, the positioning of seams. Every detail mattered. Sloppy construction would fail. Proper construction created a vessel that could handle enormous loads. The stress distribution analysis is revealing. When the bark canoe carried 1,100 pounds, the stress was distributed across approximately 140 square feet of bark surface. The stress per square foot was manageable. The layered structure handled it easily. When the plank boat approached overload at 700 pounds, stress concentrated at perhaps 50 critical joint locations. Each joint had to handle concentrated force. The weakest joint limited the total capacity. The weight savings compounded the advantage. A lighter boat sits higher in the water. Higher in the water means more reserve buoyancy. More reserve buoyancy means more load can be added before reaching minimum safe freeboard. The mathematics were straightforward, but the cumulative effect was dramatic. The cargo capacity comparison revealed the efficiency difference starkly. Anders's plank boat, 220 pounds boat weight, 700 pounds cargo capacity. Total displaced weight, 920 pounds. Cargo as percentage of total, 76%. Magnus's bark canoe, 57 pounds boat weight, 1,100 pounds cargo capacity. Total displaced weight, 1,157 pounds. Cargo as percentage of total, 95%. The bark canoe converted 95% of its displacement capacity into cargo. The plank boat converted only 76%. The bark canoe was 25% more efficient at converting displacement into useful cargo capacity. This efficiency came from better design and lighter structure. The durability surprised skeptics. People expected bark to be fragile, to tear easily, to require constant repair, but properly built bark canoes were remarkably durable. The pitch ceiling prevented water damage. The bark didn't rot. The root lashing was stronger than rope and didn't degrade. With reasonable care, a bark canoe lasted 10 to 15 years of heavy use. Comparable to wooden boats, the maintenance was actually easier. Damaged bark could be patched with new bark and pitch. Damaged stitching could be repaired with new root lashing. No need for caulking or replacing rotted planks. Just simple repairs with natural materials. The portability was another advantage. 57 pounds meant one person could carry the canoe. This enabled portaging around waterfalls or between lakes. Anders's 220-pound boat required 2 men and was still exhausting to carry. For anyone working in territory with portages, the bark canoe was enormously superior. One person could move more cargo faster. The construction cost comparison favored bark dramatically. Materials for bark canoe, $0. All materials gathered from forest. Labor, perhaps 80 hours for an experienced builder. Materials for plank boat, $30 to $50. Planks, nails, tar, paint. Labor, perhaps 100 hours. The bark canoe cost nothing but time and skill. The plank boat cost significant money plus time. For people with limited cash but access to forests, bark was the obvious choice. By 1920, the bark canoe revival was well established in the Lake Superior region. People who dismissed bark as primitive had learned it was sophisticated, lighter, stronger, more efficient, better in almost every way for cargo hauling. The technology never became mainstream for predictable reasons. It required skills that took time to learn. It required access to quality birch bark. It required understanding principles that weren't written down. And culturally, it was associated with indigenous peoples. Some European-descended people were reluctant to adopt indigenous technology even when it was superior. But among trappers, fishermen, and traders who valued performance over appearance, bark canoes became standard equipment. The knowledge spread. The skills were taught. The canoes proved themselves season after season. Magnus Erikson built bark canoes for 43 years. From 1914 to 1957, he built over 60 canoes during that time, sold some, gave others to people who needed them, taught hundreds of people the construction methods. In 1957, at age 78, Magnus built his final canoe, a 24-footer, 59 pounds, could carry 1,000 pounds safely. He gave it to a young fisherman just starting out. Take care of it, and it will take care of you. The old people knew what they were doing when they designed these. We're just relearning what they always knew. Magnus died in 1961. His obituary mentioned his years as a boat builder, but didn't mention that his boats were bark. The knowledge of what he'd contributed was already fading. The bark canoe revival gradually ended in the 1960s and 70s. Aluminum canoes became available. Cheap, durable, required no skill to manufacture. They didn't match bark for cargo capacity or weight, but they were convenient. Fiberglass canoes followed. Even more durable, even less maintenance. The convenience won over efficiency. Today, birch-bark canoe construction is considered a lost art. A few craftspeople maintain the knowledge. They build canoes for museums and collectors. The techniques are documented but rarely practiced. Most people don't know that bark canoes could carry 400 pounds more than comparable wooden boats. The knowledge exists in books and archives. The understanding of why it worked is preserved in engineering analysis, but the practical skill is rare. In museums, you can sometimes see original bark canoes from the 1800s and early 1900s. Remarkably, many are still in good condition. The bark is intact, the stitching is sound. The pitch has hardened but hasn't failed. These canoes, over a century old, could probably still float and carry loads if placed in water. The durability of the construction is evident. Academic research has validated the engineering principles. Studies of birch bark properties confirm the layered structure provides exceptional strength. Analysis of traditional designs shows optimization for stability and cargo capacity. Everything Magnus demonstrated has been confirmed by modern materials science and naval architecture. The indigenous peoples who developed bark canoe technology understood principles that took Europeans centuries to figure out. Strength-to-weight ratios, stress distribution, hydrodynamic optimization, materials selection. They understood these through observation, experimentation, and accumulated knowledge passed through generations. Before we finish, I need you to understand something critical. If you're seeing that dismissed indigenous technology often represents peak engineering, that the lightest solution can outperform the heaviest, that thousands of years of refinement beats modern assumptions, then subscribe to this channel right now. We're preserving knowledge that most of the world has forgotten or dismissed. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you're learning what truly matters. Now let's wrap up with the lessons from Magnus's bark canoe. The story of Magnus's bark canoe teaches several profound lessons about technology, materials, and wisdom. First, light can be stronger than heavy in functional terms. Strength isn't about mass, it's about structure. The bark canoe was lighter but carried more because the lightweight structure was optimized. Anders's heavy boat wasted capacity on boat weight. Magnus's light boat maximized capacity for cargo. We often confuse heavy with strong. Sometimes light is functionally superior. Second, flexibility can be superior to rigidity. Rigid structures concentrate stress. Flexible structures distribute stress. The bark canoe's flexibility allowed it to carry loads that would break a rigid structure. In engineering, we often design for rigidity. Sometimes flexibility is the better approach. Understanding when to use each is crucial. Third, indigenous technology is often peak technology. Thousands of years of refinement, countless generations of builders, testing in real-world conditions. The result is designs that are nearly perfect for their purpose. The bark canoe wasn't primitive, it was optimized. We dismiss indigenous technology as backward. Often it's more advanced than our modern alternatives. Fourth, natural materials can outperform manufactured materials. Birch bark, spruce roots, pine pitch, all gathered from forests, all superior to nails, screws, and tar for this application. Natural materials evolved over millions of years. They have properties we can't easily replicate. Understanding and using natural materials effectively is high-level engineering. Fifth, skills matter more than tools. Magnus built a superior boat with no power tools, no metal fastenings, just hand tools and knowledge. Anders built an inferior boat with better tools and modern materials. Skills and understanding trump tools and materials. We invest in tools. Sometimes we should invest in skills instead. Sixth, efficiency has multiple dimensions. The bark canoe was more efficient in cargo capacity, weight, portability, cost, and repairability. The plank boat was more efficient only in ease of construction for someone without bark canoe skills. Total system efficiency requires considering all factors. Narrow optimization misses the bigger picture. The 400-pound capacity advantage was transformative for working on Lake Superior. 400 pounds is 8 50-pound sacks. Substantial cargo. The difference between profitable fishing and break-even fishing. The difference between 1 trip and 2 trips. The difference between competitive and uncompetitive. Real-world practical advantages that affected livelihoods. The economic analysis shows the value clearly. $0 in materials. 80 hours of skilled labor. Result, a boat that outperformed a $50 boat in every important metric. The return on time investment was immediate and continued for 10 to 15 years. Over the boat's lifetime, it probably generated thousands of dollars in value through increased cargo capacity and reduced operating costs. The social dynamics followed the pattern. Before the test, mockery. Everyone dismissed bark as unsuitable, predicted failure, called Magnus romantic or foolish. After the test, respect. Everyone wanted to learn, build bark canoes, benefit from the superior technology. Recognition that indigenous knowledge was advanced, not primitive. Innovation requires confidence to persist through dismissal until proof arrives. Magnus had learned from experts. He'd seen bark canoes carry heavy loads. He knew it worked. He built according to knowledge, not European assumptions. When the test proved his approach, dismissal became admiration. Magnus's bark canoe represents the peak of pre-industrial watercraft design. Thousands of years of refinement. Optimized for every aspect of performance. Superior to anything Europeans had developed for the same use case. The technology was dismissed because of cultural bias. The people who developed it were considered primitive. Therefore, their technology must be primitive. This was false logic. The sophistication was there for anyone willing to learn and understand. The technology faded because convenience trumped performance. Aluminum and fiberglass were easier, didn't require rare skills, could be mass-produced. The convenience was attractive. The efficiency loss was acceptable when efficiency wasn't critical. But the principles remain valid. For maximum cargo capacity in a lightweight portable boat, bark construction is still optimal. Modern materials could potentially match it. But they haven't surpassed it. They mocked his bark canoe, sewn together from tree bark and roots. Fragile looking, impossible, seeming. Backward technology from primitive peoples, until it carried 400 pounds more than their boats. Until it proved bark was superior to planks, until it demonstrated that indigenous engineering was advanced engineering. Then they stopped mocking and started learning. That's how lost wisdom returns, one impossible demonstration at a time, one undeniable test result at a time, one converted skeptic at a time. Magnus's bark canoes carried cargo on Lake Superior for decades. Then the knowledge faded. Now we're remembering, the principles are preserved, the designs are documented, the understanding exists. We just need to recognize that ancient doesn't mean primitive, light doesn't mean weak, indigenous doesn't mean inferior. The bark canoe proved all of that. 57 pounds of bark carrying 1,100 pounds across Superior's waves. The lightest boat that carried the most. The smartest design ever dismissed. The best technology ever mocked.